My son called me a burden the morning his wife locked me out in the January snow, and I stood on my own porch in my socks for 11 minutes before I made one phone call that ended everything they thought they had already won. I'm grateful you're here with me today. And before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your state, gate, gate, gate. I always love knowing who's on the other side of this. Welcome back. A quick note before we start. This story blends fiction with lived truth. Names and towns have been changed, but the lesson underneath it is real. And if you've ever felt like your own family was waiting you out, I think you'll feel this one in your chest. The morning I turned 74, I woke up before my alarm, the way I always do now, and lay there in the dark listening to the house settle around me the way it always does when you've lived somewhere longer than you've lived anywhere else. 38 years in that house outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'd put the roof on twice myself. I'd built the porch swing the year my son Michael was born, and I'd repainted it every spring since, right up until my wife Dorothy passed 4 winters ago. Nobody called that morning. Nobody came by. I made my coffee, black, the way I always take it, and I sat at the kitchen table looking out at the bird feeder Dorothy used to fill every Sunday, and I told myself the silence didn't mean anything. People around Fernwood Lane thought I was just a retired high school shop teacher, quiet Frank Doyle in his cardigan, mowing his own lawn well past the age most men hire it out. And they weren't wrong. Exactly. I had taught woodworking and auto mechanics at Central Dauphin High School for 31 years, and I drove a truck older than some of my former students. What most of them didn't know, what I never saw much reason to mention at the hardware store or the diner counter, was that Dorothy and I had also spent those same 3 decades quietly buying up small parcels of land along the growth corridor east of Harrisburg, back when nobody wanted it, back when it was just scrub pine and old dairy farms nobody could make profitable anymore. We never flipped anything fast. We just held it, patient, the way you hold a note on a piano until it means something. By the time the interstate expansion came through and the logistics companies started building warehouses along that corridor, the land Dorothy and I had bought for pennies an acre was worth more than either of us ever said out loud to anyone, including, for a long time, our own son. I kept living exactly the way I looked after Dorothy died. Same truck, same cardigan, same Thursday mornings at the diner, with 2 eggs, over easy, and rye toast. I wanted to see, honestly, who showed up for me when there was nothing obvious to show up for. I reached over sometimes and touched the back of the kitchen chair across from mine, the one Dorothy always sat in with her crossword, and the cushion had gone from blue to a tired gray, and I hadn't replaced it. I wasn't ready to replace it. Happy birthday. To you, old man. I said out loud, to nobody, and drank my coffee, and that was the whole of my birthday morning, right up until 11:40, when my son finally called. Michael is 39 now, and he was always the gentler of the 2 kids Dorothy and I raised, quieter than his sister, who moved to Denver and calls twice a year, more inclined to sit beside me in the garage and hand me tools than to ask questions about what I was building. I loved that about him. I still do, underneath everything that happened. But 4 years ago, right around the time Dorothy got sick the second time, Michael married a woman named Sabrina, and something in him started to change in ways I told myself. For a long time, I was imagining. Sabrina is 34, sharp and polished, in a way that reads well on camera and in conference rooms. And she works in what she calls wealth strategy consulting, though I never once got a straight answer about what that actually meant when I asked her directly at Thanksgiving 2 years back. What I did understand, eventually, without anyone spelling it out, was that Sabrina had done her own homework on the Doyle family finances long before she ever set foot at my kitchen table. She was the one who first asked, at a 4th of July cookout, in a voice pitched just casual enough to seem like small talk, whether I'd ever had the Fernwood parcels appraised recently. Why would I need an appraisal? I said. I'm not selling. Of course not, she said, smiling, refilling my lemonade without being asked. Just curious. Property like that doesn't sit still in value, you know? It's smart to know what you're sitting on. I let it go. I let a lot of things go that year, because grief makes you generous with people in ways that aren't always earned, and because Michael seemed happy, and because I wanted, more than almost anything, and 40, mate, for that to be enough reason to trust his choices. The visits started increasing that autumn. Sabrina began bringing over casseroles I hadn't asked for, and organizing my mail into color-coded folders I hadn't requested. And every visit, somewhere in the conversation, the topic would drift, gently, expertly, toward my age, my situation, how big the house was for one man, how much upkeep the Fernwood land required, how tired I must be of managing all of it alone. Michael mostly sat quiet during these conversations, nodding along, occasionally adding a soft, "She's just looking out for you, Dad," like a man repeating a phrase he'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. By November, they had a name for what they wanted, and the name was consolidation. Sabrina used that word so often I started hearing it in my sleep. Consolidate the land under a family trust, she said, for tax efficiency. Consolidate my finances under power of attorney, just as a precaution, she said, in case anything happened suddenly. Consolidate my living situation, eventually, into something more manageable, which I understood, without her ever quite saying it, to mean assisted living, sooner, rather than later, so the house and the land could be freed up for what she called the next generation's needs. I said, no. Every time, gently but clearly, no trust, not yet. No power of attorney, not without my own lawyer reviewing every page. No discussion of moving out of the house Dorothy and I built our whole life inside of. And every time I said no, Sabrina's smile got a little more careful, a little more practiced. The kind of smile you give someone you've already decided doesn't need to be reasoned with much longer. Long. Only managed. Michael invited me to their house for a family dinner the second week of January. The first real snow of the season already 3 inches deep on the ground. More coming that night according to the radio. I almost said no. Something in me, some old instinct I'd learned to trust on job sites and in negotiations over 40 years, told me the invitation had a shape to it I didn't like. But Michael sounded, on the phone, genuinely warm, genuinely like my son, and I told myself I was being an old man who'd started seeing conspiracies in casseroles, and I said yes. Their house sits on a cul-de-sac in a newer development 20 minutes from mine, the kind of place where every driveway has the same 3 shrubs planted in the same 3 spots. I got there at 6, and Sabrina answered the door in an apron she clearly wasn't cooking in, and the house smelled like candles, not food. And I understood within about 90 seconds that dinner was not really the point of the evening. They sat me at the kitchen table, the good one with the leaf still in it from Christmas, and Michael poured me a glass of wine I didn't ask for, and Sabrina laid a manila folder on the table between us like she was dealing cards. Inside were papers. A lot of papers. A durable power of attorney, drafted by a lawyer I had never met and never authorized, naming Sabrina, not Michael, as my agent. A quitclaim deed for the Fernwood parcels, transferring them into a trust I had never heard of, with Sabrina listed as trustee. And beneath those, a third document, one that made my chest go cold in a way January air never had. A preliminary petition for guardianship, citing concerns regarding the elderly party's capacity to manage complex assets independently. "This is just precautionary, Dad," Michael said, and he wouldn't quite meet my eyes when he said it, which told me more than the words did. "We just want to make sure you're protected." "Protected from what?" I said, keeping my voice level. The way I'd learned to keep it level in 31 years of talking down teenage boys who thought a table saw was a toy. "I haven't lost my mind, Michael. I've lost my wife." "That's a different thing entirely." Sabrina leaned forward, and her voice went soft in a way that had nothing soft underneath it. "Me. Frank," she said, using my first name for maybe the 3rd time ever. "We love you, and that's exactly why this is hard to say, but you have to understand how this looks from the outside. A man your age, alone, sitting on that much undeveloped land, no clear plan for it. People take advantage of situations like that. We're trying to get ahead of it before someone worse than family does." "Nobody worse than family has shown up yet," I said. "Family's doing just fine on their own." That was when Sabrina's expression finally cracked. Just for a second, into something with real teeth behind it. "You are being incredibly selfish right now," she said, "making this so much harder than it needs to be, for everyone, including yourself." And Michael, my son, my gentle boy, who used to fall asleep against my shoulder in the truck coming home from ball games, said nothing at all. He just looked at the tablecloth. I stood up. I told them I wasn't signing anything that night, or any night, without my own attorney reading every word first. And I told them I'd be leaving now. And I walked to the front door, in the quiet, candle-smelling house, while Sabrina called after me that I was making a mistake I'd regret. The porch light was on when I stepped outside, snow coming down harder than it had been an hour before, and I turned to say one last thing to Michael, some part of me still hoping he'd follow me out, still hoping some version of my son was standing on the other side of that door, working up the nerve to say he was sorry. Instead, I heard the deadbolt turn, not the door closing behind me, by accident. The deadbolt, turning deliberately, the sound unmistakable in the cold, quiet air. I stood there in my dress shoes, no coat, because I'd left it inside on the hook by habit, and I knocked. Nobody answered. I could see the kitchen light through the window, could see Sabrina's shape moving past it once, unhurried, and Michael's shadow sitting still at the table where I'd left him. I knocked again. Still nothing. Snow was already collecting on my shoulders. My ears had started to burn with the particular sting of real cold, and somewhere in my chest a very old, very calm part of me took over. The part that had once talked a panicking 18-year-old through a table saw accident without raising my voice, and that part of me said, quietly, "So this is who they really are." And I was almost grateful, in that strange, freezing moment, to finally know it for certain. I stood on that porch for 11 minutes. I counted them off against the second hand of Dorothy's watch, the one I still wear, a slim gold Seiko she gave me on our 35th anniversary, with an inscription on the case back that reads, "Still keeping time." 11 minutes in January, cold in dress shoes, while my son sat warm on the other side of a locked door and let it happen. When the door finally opened, it was Michael, and his face had the particular gray look of a man who has done something he cannot undo, and knows it. "Dad, I'm sorry. Sabrina thought it would help you think it through. Standing out there a minute," he said, and I looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who had just handed me, without meaning to, the clearest possible proof of exactly where his loyalties now lived. I drove home in silence, heater blasting, hands trembling slightly on the wheel, not from cold anymore but from something closer to grief for a version of my son I now understood might genuinely be gone. I didn't cry. I've never been much of a crier, not even at Dorothy's funeral, not in front of anyone. But I sat in my own driveway for a long time after I parked, engine off, snow falling silent and steady in the headlights, and I let myself feel the whole shape of it. And then I did what I have always done, in every hard season of my life. I started thinking about what came next. The following Tuesday, I drove out to the Fernwood parcels myself, the ones Sabrina wanted so badly consolidated into her trust, and I walked the property line the way Dorothy and I used to walk it together every fall, checking the survey stakes, checking the drainage. My truck was parked at the top of the access road, and when I came back to it 2 hours later, I noticed, almost by accident, a thin, dark stain spreading beneath the front axle. I got down on one knee in the cold and looked underneath, the way 31 years of teaching automotive repair had trained my eye to look, and I found the brake line, cleanly nicked, not rusted through, not worn, cut, with something sharp and deliberate, in a spot no ordinary inspection would have caught until I was halfway down the long grade back toward the highway. I sat there in the snow a long moment, hands still resting on the cold undercarriage of my own truck, and felt something shift inside my chest that was not quite fear and not quite rage, but something colder and steadier than either. I thought about 11 minutes on a porch in January. I thought about a folder full of papers naming a woman I barely trusted as the sole agent over everything Dorothy and I had spent our whole lives building. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that whoever had done this had made one serious miscalculation. They believed they were dealing with an old man running out of time and options. What they didn't know was that I had spent 4 decades quietly building exactly the kind of resources a man needs when the people closest to him decide his usefulness has an expiration date. I did not confront anyone that week. I did not call Michael, did not call Sabrina, did not so much as mention the truck to either of them. Instead, on Thursday morning, I called a man named Walter Kim. I had met Walter almost 20 years earlier, when he was 19 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket in the back room of the auto parts store on Paxton Street, where he worked nights to help support his mother after his father left them both. He had a community college enrollment form crumpled in his coat pocket that he was too ashamed to fill out because he didn't have the deposit, and I happened to be in that back room picking up a fuel pump, and I asked him what was wrong, and by the time I left the store that night I'd written him a check that covered his first semester and told him I expected to be paid back only by him finishing what he started. He finished. He went on to law school on his own dime after that, and the last I'd heard, some years back, he was practicing elder law and estate litigation out of a small firm in Harrisburg. "Mr. Doyle," he said when he picked up, and I could hear real warmth in it, unforced. "It's been too long. What can I do for you?" "Walter," I said, "I need you to do something that's going to feel a little strange, and I need you to trust me the way I once asked you to trust me. Always," he said. "Tell me what you need." What I needed, I told him, was for us to move faster and quieter than my son's wife expected any 74-year-old widower could move. I needed him to file, immediately and preemptively, a formal revocation of any and all powers of attorney I had never actually signed, on record, so there could be no ambiguity later about what I had or had not authorized. I needed him to help me execute an entirely new estate plan, one that moved the Fernwood parcels into an irrevocable trust of my own design, with terms that made any future guardianship petition against me almost impossible to sustain, since the assets in question would no longer be mine to be incapacitated out of. And I needed him to help me quietly document, through the proper legal and forensic channels, exactly what had happened to the brake line on my truck, because a cut brake line is not a family disagreement. A cut brake line is attempted manslaughter, and I intended for whoever did it to eventually understand that I knew the difference. "Walter, Alter," I said, "you do not confront Sabrina, not yet, not directly. Let her keep believing she's the one setting the pace." We worked through January and most of February that way, quietly, methodically. Walter connected me with a forensic mechanic he'd used in prior cases, a careful, unhurried woman named Rosa who documented the cut brake line with the kind of precision that holds up in a courtroom: photographs, measurements, a written report ruling out ordinary wear. Walter also, separately, pulled the public filing history on Sabrina's wealth strategy consulting business, and what he found, after about 2 weeks of careful digging, was that the business had exactly one prior client relationship on record before ours, an elderly widow in Lancaster County whose family had eventually sued Sabrina's firm for improperly transferring a farm property into a trust that conveniently listed Sabrina as a paid administrator. That case had settled quietly, out of court, with a confidentiality clause, 3 years earlier. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I did anything with it. Not because I doubted it, but because some part of me was still, foolishly, hoping there might be an innocent explanation for at least one piece of what had happened, some version of events where my son wasn't fully aware of what his wife had built her career doing. I owed him, I told myself, at least the space to prove that. He did not prove it. The following week, Michael called me, his voice tight and rehearsed in a way I recognized instantly, and asked if I'd had a chance to look over those documents from dinner. Because Sabrina, he said, was hoping to finalize things soon, given everything going on. I asked him, carefully, what exactly he meant by everything going on, and there was a pause on the line just half a second too long before he said, "You know, just your age, the accident with the truck, we worry." "What accident with the truck?" I said, and let the silence stretch after it. He said, "Didn't your brakes go out a few weeks back? Sabrina mentioned you'd had some car trouble." I had told no one about the brake line. Not Michael, not Sabrina, not a single soul outside myself, Walter and Rosa, the mechanic. Which meant the only way Sabrina could possibly know my brakes had failed was if she already knew, before I ever mentioned it to anyone, precisely what had happened to that truck on that access road, because she was the one who had arranged for it to happen. I did not raise my voice. I have found, across a long life, that the men and women who raise their voices in that particular moment, the moment the whole shape of a betrayal finally clicks into place, are usually the ones who lose whatever advantage they still had left. "I appreciate you checking in," I told my son. "Tell Sabrina I'll have an answer for her soon." I called Walter the moment I hung up, and told him it was time to stop waiting. What happened over the following 6 weeks unfolded exactly the way Walter and I had mapped it out on a legal pad at his kitchen table one evening in February, over coffee that went cold twice while we talked. First, the revocation of the phantom power of attorney was formally recorded at the county courthouse, along with a new, airtight directive naming my own longtime attorney, and only him, as any future agent, should one ever become necessary. Second, the Fernwood parcels moved, quietly and irrevocably, into the new trust, structured in a way Walter assured me no guardianship petition on earth could unwind. Since the moment those papers were signed, the land legally ceased to be my asset at all, in the sense any court would recognize as vulnerable. Third, And this was the part I felt the least peace about and the most necessity for. Rose's forensic report on the brake line, along with a formal police report I filed the same week, went to the Dauphin County District Attorney's Office as evidence in an open investigation into attempted vehicular tampering, with Sabrina's name attached through the financial trail Walter had uncovered. Phone records showing calls to a mobile mechanic 2 days before my truck failed, a mechanic who, once contacted by investigators, turned out to be more than willing to describe exactly who had paid him and what she'd asked him to do, in exchange for a plea agreement that kept him out of a much longer sentence. Sabrina was arrested on a Tuesday morning in March, at her own home, in front of the same kitchen table where she had once laid out a folder of documents like she was dealing cards. Michael called me that afternoon, and for the first time since Dorothy died, I heard my son cry. "Dad," he said, and his voice had none of the rehearsed steadiness it had carried all winter. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know she'd actually. I thought it was just the papers." I thought, and he couldn't finish the sentence, because there was no way to finish it that didn't require him to admit he had known enough, and chosen, for months, not to ask the rest of the question. I let him cry for a while before I said anything. Grief and shame sound almost identical on a phone line, and I have never had it in me to rush either one. "I believe you didn't know about the truck," I said finally, and I meant it, because Walter's investigation had turned up nothing to suggest Michael had any direct knowledge of that particular plan. Only the paperwork. Only the pressure campaign. Only 4 months of standing quietly at a woman's shoulder while she tried to talk his father out of his own life. "But Michael, you locked a deadbolt on a 74-year-old man standing in the snow in January, and you knew exactly what you were doing when you did it, even if you've spent every day since telling yourself you didn't." He didn't argue with that. He just kept apologizing, in that broken, circular way people do when the apology is really for themselves, and eventually I told him I needed some time, real time, not a phone call's worth, before I knew what I wanted our relationship to look like going forward, and he said he understood, though I don't think, in that moment, he entirely did. Sabrina's case moved through the courts over the following year. The vehicular tampering charge eventually reduced through plea negotiation to a lesser offense given the mechanic's cooperation, but the financial fraud charges connected to the forged power of attorney and the attempted guardianship filing stuck, and stuck hard, aggravated by the prior, previously sealed complaint out of Lancaster County that came fully into the light once this case opened the door. She lost her professional license. She and Michael divorced 11 months after her arrest, quietly, without much drama left in either of them by that point. Michael came to see me the following spring, unannounced, on a Saturday morning when the first real warmth had finally come back into the air, and I was out at the Fernwood Parcels checking the drainage the way I do every April, and he found me there, standing in the same spot where I'd once knelt in the snow and found a cut brake line waiting under my own truck. "I know I don't get to just show up and expect anything," he said, standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his coat pockets, looking younger and more uncertain than I'd seen him look since he was a boy. "I just wanted you to know I've been seeing someone, a counselor, trying to understand why I let it get that far. Why I stood in that kitchen and let you stand outside in the snow. And what have you figured out?" I asked him, not unkindly, but not rushing to make it easy either. "That I was scared of losing her, and I let that fear get bigger than the fear of losing you," he said. I, 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 which is a hell of a thing to admit out loud to your own father. I looked at him for a long time, the wind moving through the scrub pine along the property line, the same wind that used to carry Dorothy's laugh across this field when she'd walk it with me on Sunday afternoons, and I told him what I have come to believe, slowly, across a hard year of thinking about very little else. Forgiveness is not the same thing as going back to before. I could forgive him, and I did, eventually, fully, because he is my son, and I don't have an infinite number of people left in this world who knew Dorothy the way he did. But I told him plainly that whatever relationship we rebuilt from here would have to be built the way everything worth having gets built, slowly, honestly, one earned Saturday at a time, not handed to him because the alternative made me too sad to hold on to. He nodded, and he didn't argue, and he asked if he could help me check the drainage lines the rest of the afternoon, the way he used to when he was a boy, trailing behind me with a shovel too big for his hands. And I said yes, and we worked in silence for a couple of hours, and it wasn't everything healed, not even close. but it was something honest. And honest was more than I'd had from him in over a year. There's something I've come to understand from all of this, something I wish I'd understood sooner. Before 11 minutes in the snow and a nicked brake line and a folder full of papers naming a stranger as the keeper of everything Dorothy and I ever built. I spent too long telling myself that patience was the same thing as wisdom, that staying quiet while people circled my life was somehow the mature, dignified choice. It wasn't. It was just quiet. And my quiet, I understand now, is exactly what let people who should have protected me start believing my life was theirs to manage. Don't wait, the way I nearly did, until you're standing outside your own door in the cold before you decide your dignity is worth defending out loud. Whatever family you're holding on to that has started treating your years like an inconvenience to be consolidated, your peace is not selfish to protect. It is the last, most important thing you actually own. I believe, and I've believed this since Dorothy first took my hand across a hospital bed rail and told me she wasn't afraid of what came next, that the people who last, in the end, aren't the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who stay standing, quietly, on their own porch, in their own name, no matter how long the door stays locked. This was my story, about a family worth saving, and a betrayal that had to be answered before it could be. If any part of this found something true in you, tell me in the comments. Tell me what part of it stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to stand back up for yourself. And if you believe, the way I do, that quiet dignity eventually finds its way home, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, and I'd be glad to have you here for them. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means more than you probably know. And one last note, the stories on this channel, including this one, are works of fiction, crafted for reflection and storytelling, with certain details changed or imagined. If this particular kind of story isn't for you, no hard feelings at all. I hope you find exactly what you're looking for. But if you're still here with me, I'm glad you stayed.